People of Earth, attention.
What you're observing may well be the beginning of the end.
You're twice as heavy as you were on Mars.
Give me your widest beam.
These things take over a man's mind. He becomes a robot.
In my case, sir, the question is totally without meaning.
Step into the future, a half-century from today.
Is this the end of our civilization?
The Martians can conquer the Earth in 6 days.
The same number of days it took to create it.
Klaatu, Barada, Nikto. We must remember those words.
Initiating episode 0. A little bit of mansplaining.
Greetings, pathetic earthlings. I'm Dan Gale from Planet S in Somerset. Welcome to It Watched from... hang on. It Watched from Outer Space. A podcast devoted... I'm not going to be doing that again. A podcast devoted to the vintage science fiction films of the 1950s and 60s. That's right, another movie-based podcast, recorded by another girlfriendless dweeb on the internet. Yay! The aim is to tell you, without mansplaining too much, about various science fiction films made between 1950 and 1969, which, as much as it pains me to admit, are now technically classed as a bit old. 1950 is almost 7/10 of a century ago. Cinema has changed a lot in the meantime, and so have humans. Attitudes towards war, peace, patriotism and what it means to be an American, religion, overpopulation, class, the atom, space exploration, pointed bras, Hollywood and its special effects have all changed enormously over the last 70 years. Our views on equality in race, gender, sexuality, disability and xenophobia have also moved on. In some parts of the world. And it might, I stress might, be interesting to see how our attitudes now affect our enjoyment of these films, looking at them with our modern eyes and our 5-second attention spans. So this is episode 0, an introduction, a prologue, a free sample to see if you like it without having to commit to anything. It's kind of like those tiny crackers with tinned spray-on cheese that you get given in supermarket doorways that allow you to taste test first and save you the hassle of having to drive all the way back to the store to get a refund once you've bought a can and taken it home, only to realise that it really does taste as bad as it looks. You might have guessed that the watched in the title refers to reviewing films and that the it refers to me, and a more perfect description of me I couldn't conceive. But what, someone somewhere must surely be asking, about the outer space bit? Well, the premise here, and bear with me on this, is that I'm stuck out here in space in my tiny 2-bedroom spaceship, and since that meteorite storm launched my entire collection of Razzler magazines out into space through a malfunctioning airlock, I only have old science fiction movies to keep me company. So, I thought, why not do a podcast about them and beam it back to Earth, whilst it's still there? Why specifically the 1950s and 60s? Well, that was the era, in Hollywood at least, in which this genre seemed to peak. And yes, there were classic science fiction films before 1950, and some after 1969. 1977 was a pretty impressive year, but I have to draw the line somewhere. Also, this is my favourite era, the one in which very often the ideas were bigger than the budgets, and the technology was only just managing to keep up with the creative demands of the scripts. Because of the occasional great imaginations on show, and because of these tiny budgets, you'll find that some of these films, and they're from all over the world, have the potential to be quite amazing, whilst others will be just a few shades of brown above horseshit. In each episode, I hope to watch and review one of these films spread out over short mini-seasons, linked by a theme, maybe a director, a star, or even a word in the title, to help celebrate these movies, reminisce with those of you who already know and love them, and hopefully spread the word to the as yet unconverted. Join us. Truthfully, it will not be an easy task. There's about 300 films on this list, and I may need your help. There will be classics, there will be turds, but there will also be atomic brains, 50-foot women, giant ants, and butt-ugly Martians straight from Uranus, and I can't deal with them all on my own. There may be guests helping me out in some episodes, if I can ever find any. It's so lonely out here in space. That and I have no friends. And there might even be a competition or two just to keep you listening. A big inspiration for this podcast is the book Keep Watching the Skies by the late Bill Warren, a 2-volume book that greatly influenced my sci-fi viewing as a teenager when I first found them in my local library in the early 90s. Libraries. Remember them? They're a bit like the internet but without all the porn and racism. Bill Warren reprinted them as an omnibus edition in the mid-90s and rewrote a lot of what he'd written in a brand new edition published just a few years before he passed away, so it is available to buy in several forms and I highly recommend it. I have the omnibus edition from the mid-90s, a whopping 1,300-page tome that reviews every major science fiction film released in the USA from 1950 to 1962. I intended to stretch those years out a little bit, just to the end of the 60s, just so we don't miss out on titles like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Planet of the Apes, Barbarella, or Zontar the Thing from Venus. Now, why am I bothering to do this? Every gobshite with a mic and a laptop is making podcasts now. I listen to podcasts more than any other form of radio or music, and I just wanted to have a go myself. My big listens are, in alphabetical order, James Bond Radio, Kaiju Cast, Kermode and Mayo's Film Review, The Nerdist, or ID10T, or whatever it's called this week, and Adam Roach's Attaboy Clarence podcast and The Secret History of Hollywood, which is, hands down, the best movie podcast series ever written, since listening was invented. Also, comedy is a big draw for me, so the Adam Buxton podcast and Richard Herring's Leicester Square Theatre podcast, or Reherlistopur, as all the cool Martians are calling it now, are superb time fillers, and I heartily recommend them all. Especially if you have a love for comedy, knob gags, Bond, Godzilla, jaw-dropping classical Hollywood biographies, or gratuitous movie nerdity in general. I'm in the privileged position of being able to mop up after these pioneers, stealing all their best ideas and filtering them through my lazy mind. So apologies to these shows for my blatant theft, but then imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Which is why that shape-shifting alien that scanned my brain patterns keeps knocking on the airlock door, looking like different BBC weather girls. But don't worry, I'm not letting it in.
You're not the real Laura Tobin, now f*** off.
My first foray into podcasting was a couple of documentary-style episodes for James Bond Radio. Google Tape Secret, or You Only Live Splice, if you want to have a listen to them. And I enjoyed doing that so much I just thought I wanted to have a go with another genre. So, here I am, floating around my tin can, far above the moon. Planet Earth is blue and there's nothing I can do, apart from watch old B-movies. So, where in the pile do I begin? Well, we can start by debunking the myth that these are all B-movies, and that B somehow stands for bad. You probably know all this anyway, but back in the days when films didn't all have Transformers in them, and they weren't all 2.5 hours long each, you might go to see a double bill of films at the cinema. Now, a cinema, for younger listeners, was like watching a film on your phone, except you had to pay for it. The big studios would release a large film that they were very proud of, maybe a classical drama or a big star vehicle, that would be film A, and then pair it with a shorter, less critically important feature that was made on a much lower budget, just to help you make a night of it. That would be film B. In the 1950s, the political atmosphere in America was one of extreme paranoia and xenophobia. Imagine that. so the subjects of these films were very often metaphors, allowing for thinly veiled social or political commentaries. Are you worried your teenage son is being led astray and turning into someone you just don't recognize anymore? See, I was a teenage werewolf. Or are you worried about the tyrannical threat of ideas from communist Russia seeping into wholesome America and destroying its values from within? See, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Following the events of the Second World War, the world saw the rise of the Soviet Union and communism, plus the invention of the mysterious, all-powerful nuclear bomb, which helped end one war but immediately kick-started another. There was also the start of mankind's first footsteps into space, teamed with continuous stories in the press of sightings of unidentified flying objects. So very often these B-movies would be science fiction. Or, as Forrest J. Ackerman, wordsmith, punmeister extraordinaire, and editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine called it, sci-fi. That's where the term comes from. He invented it. Thank you, Forry. So yes, some B-movies were cheap, but that's the way small independent studios got onto the ladder, making cheap, popular films, and big studios assumed that most people would probably go home after the A-movie, so there was little point spending a fortune on a film that some people would just fall asleep through. But science fiction cinema and radio was massively popular by the 1950s, and so some of these films were very prestigious productions, made by top studios with big stars, very much A-movies. So there you go. Not everything we'll be discussing will be cheapo rubbish. Although a lot of it will. As cinema of the mind is possibly even more powerful than cinema on screen, I'd like to introduce you to some radio science fiction for you all in each episode too. This will come in the form of short dramas from two American science fiction radio series, Dimension X, which was broadcast from 1950 to 1951, and its follow-up, X-1, from 1955 to 1958. So there'll be plenty for you to get your teeth and your ears, or your ear teeth, into. Look, on some planets, some people have ear teeth. Ours is not to judge. Before we start, I want to mention that this podcast is sponsored by absolutely nothing whatsoever. Not at the moment, at least. We'll see. If you want to chuck a few galactic credits my way because you're enjoying what you're hearing, please feel free. It will be most welcome. There's a donate button on the website, but you're under no obligation to use it. Unless I set the hypnotoads on you. And then you will feel very, very obliged to use it. The webpage, if you're interested, is itwatchedfromouterspace.com. I'm also on Twitter at itwatched, but I'm not on Facebook. Life's just too short. Although I've seen a lot of the films that we'll be reviewing, it's been many, many years, and I can't remember a lot of them. Also, there's a good few that I've never ever seen, so this will be a good excuse to finally give them a watch. If this turns out to be the first and only podcast I ever make in this series, I thought I'd start with titles I could review that would at least draw in a bit of a crowd, something popular with a decent reputation. So if you've tuned in hoping to hear my review of Nude on the Moon or Kurusu Beast of the Amazon, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait. So where in this vast universe of blobs and monsters do you begin reviewing? Well, I considered alphabetical order. Then maybe order of release. Nah, it's too predictable. There's a lot to be said for randomness. After all, aren't we all here through some random event? I don't mean your parents hooking up behind the school disco, I mean the Big Bang. It's completely random. Us all being on a planet in the Goldilocks zone, the correct temperature for life to exist, not too hot, not too cold, random. The fact that we're carbon-based life forms that are 60% water, and there's conveniently loads of carbon and water all over the planet, random. Bill Bailey, Noel Fielding, Ross Noble, completely random, and they're brilliant. No, look, order is for squares. Embrace the chaos of the universe. So after every third episode, we'll pluck another themed group indiscriminately off the list. whether the films are important or not. But to start it all off, and to make a halfway decent beginning, I've gone with 3 of the most fondly remembered movies directed by the same fella, Mr. Jack Arnold. So, join me in episode 1 and help me cast my beady, singular, floating eyeball at his breakout film in the science fiction genre, the classic It Came From Outer Space. Which is ironic, because that's nearly the title of this podcast, and it's exactly where my podcast is coming from. My current position is, well, I'm between galaxies at the moment, around sector 455, around coordinates 47583.34/55645.4. And I really can't make that sound any more exciting than it already is. If I look out the window, all I can see is darkness. I hope that helps. I think the ship's computer knows which way to go, so I just let her get on with it. Don't argue with the pilot. First thing I learned at space camp. Well, that and mirror signal maneuver doesn't have the same meaning when you can travel in 3 dimensions. That was lesson 2. Anyway, look, enough guff from me. Actually, that was lesson 3. Don't guff in a spaceship. Hopefully I'll see you next time. This is Dan Gale, lone occupant of Her Majesty's Space Capsule X-1, signing off.
Communicate with us on Twitter at @itwatched, or send us a message at itwatchfromouterspace.com. End of transmission. Keep washing your skis.
Cooey.